Somewhere in the ruins of an ancient city, a man pressed marks into wet clay. He had no idea that thousands of years later, an artificial intelligence would stare at those marks and begin to understand them. What Grok AI just did with 40,000 ancient inscriptions is not just a technological achievement. It is the beginning of a conversation between the present and a past that has been completely silent for millennia. But before we go further, we need to slow down, because the headlines you have been reading, the ones that say AI has cracked the oldest language in human history, they are telling you only a fraction of the real story. The actual story is stranger, deeper, and far more humbling than any headline can capture. It is a story about how long humans have actually been speaking, how little of that we have managed to preserve, and why some of the greatest mysteries in all of human history are still sitting right in front of us, completely unread, waiting. And at the center of all of this is a question that no technology, no matter how powerful, has yet been able to answer. What was the very first human language? Where did it go? And is there any chance, even the smallest chance, that something of it still survives somewhere in the ancient symbols we have not yet learned to read? To understand what Grok is actually doing, we first need to understand something that most people get confused about the moment this topic comes up. When scientists talk about the oldest language, they are not all talking about the same thing. There are actually two completely different ideas hiding inside that one phrase, and mixing them up leads to a very distorted picture of what is actually happening. The first idea is the oldest written language. This means a language for which we have physical, tangible proof. Clay tablets you can hold, stone inscriptions you can photograph, symbols carved into surfaces that have survived thousands of years. Languages like Sumerian, Egyptian, and Akkadian fall into this category. These languages survived because at some point, someone made the decision to write them down. They left a record. And because of that record, we can study them, analyze them, and in many cases, actually read them. The second idea is something called a reconstructed ancestral language. This is a much more complicated concept. Here, what linguists do is take many different modern and ancient languages, compare their words, their grammar structures, and their sound patterns, and then work backwards. They trace connections, follow the threads of similarity, and try to reconstruct a language that must have existed much earlier, but for which no direct record has ever been found. The most famous example of this is Proto-Indo-European. Nobody has ever read a Proto-Indo-European text. No tablet exists. No inscription survives. And yet, by comparing Latin and Greek and Sanskrit and Gothic and Old Irish and dozens of other languages, researchers have been able to piece together a remarkably detailed picture of what this ancient root language probably looked like, what words it had, what sounds it used, what its grammar was built around. Now here's where the problem starts. When news headlines announce that AI has analyzed the oldest language in human history, most people assume these two things are the same. They picture an AI reaching all the way back to the very first words ever spoken by human beings. But that is not what is happening. What Grok is doing is working with the languages that actually survived, whether in written form or as reconstructed patterns. It is connecting existing data, finding new patterns inside that data, and helping us understand things that human scholars have been struggling with for decades. That is genuinely impressive. But it is not the same as discovering where human language actually began. And this distinction matters enormously, because the real origin of human language is something that sits far, far beyond what any AI can currently reach. Scientists believe that human beings have been speaking in some form for somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 years. Some researchers push that estimate even further back. The physical evidence for this comes from our own bodies. The human larynx sits lower in the throat than in any other primate. This positioning allows us to produce an extraordinary range of sounds, far more than any other animal. The hypoglossal canal, the channel that carries the nerve controlling tongue movement, is significantly more developed in modern humans than in our closest evolutionary relatives. These are biological adaptations for complex speech, and they show up clearly in the fossil record. But here's the problem. Biology can tell us that humans were capable of speech. It cannot tell us what they actually said. It cannot capture a single word. It cannot preserve the sound of a single sentence. The actual content of those ancient conversations is gone completely. There is no audio. There is no writing. There is not even a symbolic trace of what language was like during the vast majority of human existence on this planet. And the reason for that brings us to one of the most staggering facts in all of human history. Writing, the act of putting language into physical symbols that can survive time, is only about 5,000 years old. Think about what that means. If humans have been speaking for at least 100,000 years, and writing only began around 5,000 years ago, that leaves a gap of 95,000 years. And if the more generous estimates of language origins are correct, that gap could stretch to 200,000 years, or even beyond. For all of that time, people were talking. They were building communities around shared language. They were telling their children stories about the world. They were describing their fears and their gods and their memories. And every single word of all of that, every conversation in every language, across every civilization that rose and fell during those long ages, vanished the instant it was spoken, not recorded, not preserved, simply gone. How many languages existed during those thousands and thousands of years? How many completely unique ways of seeing the world and expressing that vision were developed, refined, passed down through generations, and then lost without leaving even the faintest trace? We have absolutely no way of knowing. And that silence, that enormous yawning silence at the beginning of human language history, is something that no AI, including Grok, can reach across. But what AI can do, and what makes this moment genuinely exciting, is work with the languages that did manage to survive. And the oldest of those surviving written languages takes us back to a very specific place and time. The time is around 3400 to 3100 BCE. The place is ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, in what is today the country of Iraq. Here, in the cities of the Sumerian civilization, something extraordinary began. A man, probably a record keeper of some kind, picked up a sharp reed stylus and pressed it into a small tablet of wet clay. The marks he made were wedge-shaped, pressed in at different angles and combinations to represent different things. This writing system would eventually be called cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge, and it is one of the oldest writing systems ever discovered. Now, how did these clay tablets survive for more than 5,000 years? The answer involves one of history's great ironies. The buildings where these tablets were stored, libraries and administrative centers, were sometimes destroyed by fire. You might expect fire to destroy clay tablets along with everything else, but what actually happened is that the fire baked the clay, hardening it the way a kiln hardens pottery. The buildings burned to the ground, but the tablets inside became harder and more durable than they ever were when the buildings were standing, and so they survived. Thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, waiting underground for archaeologists to find them thousands of years later. What do those tablets say? They contain an entire world. Records of grain storage and land transactions, tax accounts and legal codes, hymns written to gods whose names we still know, and most famously, the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature in human history. This epic contains a flood narrative that scholars believe is roughly 1,000 years older than the flood story preserved in the Bible. These were not primitive people scratching simple marks. These were sophisticated thinkers writing down complex ideas about mortality, friendship, divine will, and the nature of human existence. Sumerian, as a language, has one characteristic that makes it deeply mysterious, even beyond its age. It is what linguists call a language isolate. That means it has no known relatives anywhere in the world. No clear ancestor has been identified. No clear descendant has been found. It appeared, flourished, produced an enormous body of literature and record keeping, and then gradually faded as other languages took over in Mesopotamia. But where it came from, what language or languages might have given rise to it, nobody knows. The people who pressed those first marks into clay were already the product of thousands of years of language evolution. Their language was already sophisticated, already structured, already capable of expressing complex ideas. But the history of how it got that way is completely lost. After Sumer, the written world expanded. Around 2690 to 2600 BCE, another of history's great civilizations was developing its own writing system. Egypt. The hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt are among the most visually recognizable symbols in human history. But these were not just decorative marks carved into walls for aesthetic effect. They were a fully developed writing system capable of expressing complex religious ideas, political authority, administrative records, and elaborate cosmological belief systems. The pyramid texts, found inscribed inside the tombs of the 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs, are considered among the oldest religious writings ever discovered. These are not simple statements. They describe in extraordinary detail what the ancient Egyptians believed happened to a person after death, where the soul traveled, what obstacles it faced, and how it could navigate its way through the dangers of the afterlife. An entire theology, preserved in stone from more than 4,000 years ago. What makes Egyptian even more remarkable from a linguistic perspective is that it did not simply disappear. Egyptian belongs to a family of languages called Afro-Asiatic, and the descendants of that ancient language are still spoken by hundreds of millions of people today. Arabic, Hebrew, Amharic, Somali, and many other languages all carry within them deep structural connections to the language that the ancient Egyptians used to inscribe their beliefs about the universe on tomb walls. The voice of a civilization that flourished 4,500 years ago is still alive, transformed and evolved, but genuinely connected in the languages of the modern world. Around the same time, another major language was rising to prominence in Mesopotamia. Akkadian was a Semitic language that gradually began to replace Sumerian as the dominant spoken tongue of the region. But something fascinating happened in the process. Akkadian adopted the cuneiform writing system that the Sumerians had developed. The language changed completely. The grammar, the vocabulary, the sound system, everything about the spoken language was different, but the writing system remained the same. It is not entirely unlike what happens today when speakers of completely different languages all use the same alphabet or the same keyboard to write their words. Akkadian eventually became something even more significant. It became the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East. The clearest evidence of this comes from the Amarna letters, clay tablets dating to around 1350 BCE. These are correspondence between the Egyptian pharaoh and kings and rulers across the ancient world, from Babylon to Canaan to the Hittite Empire. And almost all of them are written in Akkadian. Different civilizations, separated by enormous distances, speaking entirely different native languages, conducting their most critical diplomatic communications in one shared tongue. In some ways, it performed a function not entirely unlike the role English plays in international relations today. Sumerian, Egyptian, Akkadian. These three languages represent some of the oldest written records we have. But even they are not the beginning. Even the people who created these languages were already the heirs of thousands of years of linguistic history that left no written trace whatsoever. They were already at the end of a long road, not at the start of it. So what exactly is Grok doing with all of this? What makes its approach different from the work that human scholars have been doing for generations? The first thing to understand is that Grok is not doing translation in the simple sense of the word. It is not working like a dictionary that looks up one word and gives you its equivalent in another language. What it is doing goes much deeper than that. It is analyzing the internal structure of ancient languages at multiple levels simultaneously. It looks at grammar, which means how sentences are constructed and what rules govern the way words relate to each other. It examines morphology, which is how individual words are formed and modified to carry different meanings. It studies syntax, the order in which words appear, and what that order tells us about meaning and emphasis. It analyzes how languages mark tense, how they distinguish between what happened in the past and what is happening now, and what might happen in the future. It looks at how verbs interact with the objects they act upon. And it tracks distributional similarity, which means it notices which patterns appear repeatedly in which kinds of contexts. All of this is work that human linguists do as well. The difference is one of scale and simultaneity. A brilliant human scholar might spend an entire career mastering Sumerian. Another might dedicate their life to Akkadian, another to Egyptian. But no single human mind can hold all those language systems, along with the entire comparative framework of linguistic typology, in active working memory at once. Grok can. When it encounters an unusual pattern in a Sumerian tablet, it does not just consider that pattern within the context of Sumerian. It immediately compares it with Akkadian structures, places it alongside Egyptian grammar, checks it against the broader Afro-Asiatic language family, and simultaneously tests it against patterns found in other ancient language systems from completely different parts of the world. That kind of cross-referential analysis at that kind of speed simply cannot be done by a single human mind working alone. But here is something important that rarely makes it into the headlines. Grok is not generating this knowledge from nothing. It is working with data that human scholars spent generations collecting, decoding, and organizing. The decoded grammars, reconstructed vocabularies, and painstakingly assembled databases of ancient inscriptions, all of that pre-existing scholarship is what Grok draws on. It is not replacing the work of linguists and archaeologists. It is taking accumulated human knowledge and processing it at a scale and speed that allows new connections to emerge. And one of the places where those new connections are most needed is in the analysis of scripts that still have not been fully decoded. The oracle bone script of ancient China is a striking example. Dating to around 1200 BCE during the Shang dynasty, this script was used to inscribe questions onto animal bones and turtle shells. People would write their questions, apply heat to the bones, and then read the cracks that appeared as answers from the divine. Questions about weather, about harvests, about wars, about the health of rulers. The bones were then preserved, and thousands of them have been found. But many of the symbols on those bones are still not fully understood. Some symbols changed so dramatically over time that their connection to later Chinese characters has been completely broken. What AI has done with Oracle Bone Script is apply diffusion-based models, the same kind of models used in image generation, to the problem of unknown symbols. These models study the symbols that are already understood, their shapes, their contexts, the patterns of how they appear alongside other symbols, and then generate ranked hypotheses about what the unknown symbols might mean. Not definitive translations, not confident declarations, just probability distributions. A list of possibilities ordered from most likely to least likely, based on every pattern the system has been able to identify. Grok then takes those hypotheses and does something that pure pattern matching systems cannot do. It places them in context. It asks what grammatical role the unknown symbol seems to play. It considers what semantic domain the surrounding text seems to be dealing with. It weighs the historical context of what we know about Shang Dynasty society and what kinds of things people in that time and place were most likely to be writing about. The result is not certainty, but it is reasoned, structured, a probabilistic inference, and that is enormously more useful than a complete blank. There are scripts, however, where even this approach hits a wall. These are the languages historians sometimes call the great silences of history. Scripts that exist, that can be seen and photographed and cataloged, but that have stubbornly refused to yield their meaning despite generations of brilliant effort. The difficulty is not a lack of trying, it is a structural problem. To decode an unknown script, you need an anchor point. You need either a bilingual inscription, a text written in the unknown script alongside the same content in a known language, or you need to identify the language family the script belongs to. Without at least one of those things, decoding becomes almost impossibly difficult. Linear A is a perfect illustration of this problem. In 1952, a researcher named Michael Ventris successfully decoded a script called Linear B, which had been found on tablets from Bronze Age Greece. The moment that happened, an entire lost civilization suddenly had a voice again. We could read what those people had written. We could learn about their trade, their administration, their records. A world that had been silent for 3,000 years started to speak. It was one of the greatest breakthroughs in the history of archaeology. And because Linear B shares many symbols with the older script called Linear A, researchers became hopeful. If we understood Linear B, surely Linear A was within reach. But the hope did not hold. Knowing the sounds of some symbols is not the same as knowing what the words those sounds form actually mean. You can pronounce something, you can produce the sounds correctly, but if you do not know which language family those sounds belong to, if you have no framework for understanding grammar or vocabulary, the pronunciation is hollow, it is sound without meaning. And Linear A has no bilingual inscription. There is no Rosetta Stone for it. The tablets are right there. The symbols can be photographed. Some sounds can perhaps be approximated, but the meaning stays completely out of reach. And then there is the deepest mystery of all, the one that sits at the very heart of this entire discussion, the Indus script. The Indus Valley civilization flourished from approximately 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE across a territory in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. And it was not a small or primitive society. The cities of the Indus Valley were built with a level of urban planning that was astonishing for their time. Streets laid out in precise grids, advanced drainage systems that were, in many respects, more sophisticated than those in contemporary civilizations elsewhere in the world. Standardized weights and measures used consistently across the entire civilization, houses with indoor water facilities, and in terms of sheer geographic extent, the Indus Valley civilization was actually larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It was the largest urban civilization of its era anywhere on Earth. And it had a writing system. The Indus script has more than 400 distinct signs. More than 4,000 inscriptions have been found, carved onto small seals, tablets, and various artifacts. Researchers have been studying these inscriptions for over a century. And despite all of that effort, despite the application of every analytical method available, not a single word of the Indus script has ever been confidently read. Not one word, not one syllable, not one sound with any certainty attached to it. The debates about what kind of writing system it even is have not been resolved. Some researchers believe it is logographic, meaning each sign represents a complete word or concept. Others argue it could be syllabic, with each sign representing a sound or syllable. Some think it might be alphabetic. And a minority of researchers have gone so far as to argue that it might not even be a true writing system at all, that it could be a notation system of some kind, a set of symbols that conveyed information without being tied to a specific spoken language. The fact that this most fundamental question, is it even a language, remains unresolved after more than 100 years of study tells you everything you need to know about the depth of this mystery. AI and statistical methods have made some progress here. Analyses of sign frequency, of which signs appear at the beginning of inscriptions versus the end, of which combinations of signs repeat across different artifacts, have revealed that the Indus script does display structural patterns consistent with a true language. The signs do not appear to be randomly distributed. There is order in them. There are rules. The behavior of the signs looks, in statistical terms, very much like the behavior of signs and systems that we know represent actual language. That is significant. It strongly suggests that whatever the Indus script is, it is not random marking. It is structured communication. But statistical structure alone cannot give you meaning. It cannot tell you what the words mean or what language family the script belongs to. And without a bilingual inscription, without any known related language to compare it to, the meaning stays locked away. This is where Grok's approach goes beyond simple pattern analysis. Rather than just mapping the frequency of signs, it tries to reconstruct the probable context of the inscriptions. It asks what a society like the Indus Valley civilization was most likely to be writing about. What were the major concerns of urban life in that era? Trade, administration, religion, agricultural management, measurement, and standardization. By building a probabilistic model of what semantic domains were likely to appear in Indus inscriptions, and then comparing the structural patterns of those inscriptions with the structural patterns of neighboring language families from the same broad time period, Grok can generate hypotheses about what certain combinations of signs might be pointing toward, even without being able to confirm the specific words. It is not decoding, but it is meaningful structured inference that narrows the range of possibilities and identifies the most productive directions for future research. And that points towards something critically important about what AI can and cannot do in this field. There is a hard limit, and that limit is data. Grok cannot identify the first human language because no data about that language exists anywhere. Not a symbol, not a recording, not a structural trace. If something was never recorded in any form, there is nothing to analyze. No pattern recognition system, no matter how sophisticated, can extract information from a complete absence of information. The silence before writing is absolute, and it will stay absolute. But within the boundaries of what has survived, the potential is enormous. And the most exciting possibility is one that researchers rarely discuss openly, because it requires a particular kind of patience and luck. Among the thousands of sites from ancient civilizations that have not yet been fully excavated, among the artifacts still buried, among the ruins still unexamined, there may be bilingual inscriptions waiting to be found. The Rosetta Stone, which finally cracked the code of Egyptian hieroglyphs, was discovered by accident by soldiers during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. Nobody was looking for it specifically. It was simply there, waiting in the ground. Another such discovery, for Linear A, for the Indus script, for one of the other great silent scripts of history, is not impossible. It is simply unknown when and whether it will happen. What Grok can do is prepare for that moment. It can build the most complete and structured probabilistic map of every undecoded script that exists. It can identify which patterns are strongest, which are weakest, which connections to other language families are worth exploring further. And most importantly, it can identify the specific kinds of evidence that would be most useful if new discoveries are made. So that when, not if, but when some future archaeological expedition uncovers a tablet or a seal or an inscription that provides the key that has been missing, the entire apparatus of analysis will be ready to use it immediately. There is something profound in all of this that goes beyond the technology and beyond the archaeology. Think about the three moments we have been circling around throughout this whole story. 5,000 years ago, a man in Mesopotamia pressed marks into wet clay with no idea that anyone would ever read them. 3,500 years ago, the Minoan people of Crete were writing in their own language, a language whose voice has been silent ever since. 4,000 years ago, the people of the Indus Valley civilization were carving symbols onto seals, symbols that have defeated every attempt to understand them across more than a century of effort. And now, today, an AI is looking at all of those voices simultaneously, comparing them, connecting them, mapping the patterns within the silence. We may be closer than we have ever been to the moment when one of those doors finally opens. And if that moment comes, it will not simply be a linguistic victory. It will be a fundamental shift in our understanding of human history. Because language is not just a communication tool. Language is how human beings think. Language is how we organize our understanding of time, of cause and effect, of identity, of belonging. When a lost language comes back to life, we do not just learn new words. We gain access to an entire way of seeing the world that has been invisible to us, a perspective that shaped the thinking of thousands of people across many generations and then disappeared. Every undecoded script is a locked room full of human thought, and we are, right now, living in the moment when the tools to open those rooms are finally being developed. The question is not whether they will be opened. The question is only which one opens first.